Again, good afternoon. We are hosting a little special little panel discussion today as school years have wrapped up and we're touching base. And so we've got a number of folks who have joined in order to answer some common questions that board members may have. And we couldn't have a more fantastic crew. So today we've got Brad Banasic joining us. Brad, you want to speak for just a second as though people may not know you, even though we know they all do?
All right, thank you, Jesse. I'm legal counsel and director of labor relations for MASB. Primarily, I'm responsible for assisting our members in providing legal information to them, and that legal information is provided through classes, through publications, but more so being contacted by members, whether it be by email or phone call, and assisting members with legal questions. That's the legal side of it. The labor side of it, we do offer negotiation services for school districts, providing guidance to districts on their labor relations with their employees. And as you can imagine, based upon the laws that we recently changed, that's going to be a busy area for us starting next year. So we're looking forward to assisting our members in that capacity.
Awesome. Next up, we have Debbie Stair. And Debbie, why don't you go ahead and talk a little, again, as though people don't know you, even though they probably should, about what you do for MASB.
Thanks, Jesse. I am the Assistant Director for Leadership Development, which really means all things governance related, mostly out in district activities. So if your district chooses to have a board workshop with an outside facilitator, I'm likely either conducting it myself or at least scheduling one of our many facilitators that we have around the state. I'm also in charge of our strategic planning processes for school districts. I work with board presidents very closely. And much like Brad said, I'm probably the other go-to phone call that board members make when they just have a question about anything. I always send them to Brad for legal, but if everything else is probably something they can probably ask me.
Which is why you two are here today, honestly. And last but certainly not least, Don Wetruba. Go ahead, Don, and tell us who you are.
Thanks, Jesse.
Who are you, Don?
The executive director from MASB, and my primary job is keeping Brad and Debbie happy and here at MASB so that our members get the answers that they need. And primarily, of course, work with our board of directors on overall direction for the organization and trying to interact with our members and figure out how to serve you best. And you've seen over the last week or so, we sent out emails asking for questions to be provided to this group. And that's what we're going to work off of today. Responses that we receive back from our members and ones that Debbie and Brad and I and Jesse see and hear often from our members. So we're going to spend some time answering questions that we have already kind of got preloaded in our minds that came from all of you, but also we'll give you the opportunity through the Q&A function on the Zoom today. You can pose other ones if we have time, and I give no promises that we'll have that by the time we get through other questions, but if we have time, we will try to get answers on things that you pose to us. And so we'll be watching that throughout the format of this. So thank you all very much for being on today. Really appreciate that. And Jesse's given me the green light to kind of get started with probably one of the first questions that I think can be confusing for our newest members. And that is, we are the Michigan Association of School Boards. And so a question that often comes up is, do we only serve school boards, or do we serve the whole district in some capacity? And as you hear answers today, I think you'll see that although our primary member is the Board of Education within a school district, we really do focus on the governance team, which includes the superintendent and sometimes members of the superintendent's cabinet. Debbie mentioned earlier doing strategic planning. That is not done just with the board. That is with the board and the leadership team and the community in that case. And so we do we don't need a school board member to call us to ask a question on behalf of a superintendent. The superintendent can also call us. They are in our database as well. We really do consider board members and superintendents and superintendent administrative assistants. All three are members, and we provide service directly. We answer questions to all three. There are times maybe when there is maybe a conflict between the board and the superintendent, and then yes, the board members are our primary members, but our hope is that we can always stop those situations from happening by being involved with your district and not be in a place where that conflict exists. So that's the first thing that we've heard from members regularly and over the years is, who do you serve? And, you know, if my soup has a question, does he or she need to go separately to MASB? Or does the board member have to ask? Nope, we serve that leadership team. Any of those three entities can call us for clarification. We're happy to answer their questions and serve that leadership group at the district.
And Don, one follow-up point to that question I get frequently is, can only the board president, contact me on a legal question? Because, that's how it works with your retained legal counsel. Only the board president and the superintendent can incur that, that fee by contacting district legal counsel. It's different with MASB. All members of the board are members of MASB, and whether you're a trustee, vice president, whatever the case may be, you can contact me with a legal question. You don't need specific authorization, from your board president or superintendent to do that.
Yeah, that's a good clarification, Brad. And another practice that we, depending on the question, sometimes it's very straightforward. Brad answers the question through an email or a phone call. I will say from MASB's perspective, because your whole board is our member as well as your superintendent. If we see a place where there's a lot of contention going on in a board or something like that, and particularly an email question, we may often respond to the whole board and the superintendent at that time if it's appropriate, so that everybody's hearing the same answer, because we don't want to get into the situation where a single board member or maybe different sides of an argument are trying to get answers. And then they say, oh, Brad or Debbie said this. If we have the opportunity to diffuse that and do it in an email so everybody hears the same answer, that's a practice that we try to get into, to try to make sure that we don't, we're not making it worse in a district for providing answers. We try to make sure we're transparent and give the same answer to everybody.
Awesome. Great clarification. Are we ready to move on to question number 2? I think this is appropriate for you to start with, Debbie. What is governance really?
It is one of those concepts, I think, that is challenging, especially for new board members to sort of wrap their arms around, because it's not something most people do in their everyday work, right? We all, whatever our responsibilities, whether they're in the home or outside of the home, whatever our responsibilities are, we sort of have a tendency to roll our sleeves up and get in there and do the actual work. Right? Or at the highest level, maybe manage the work. And governance is neither of those things. It's overseeing the work of others and ensuring that the work is being done through processes and structures that are set up. So it's almost easier to say what governance isn't than it is to say what governance is, right? It's not management. It's not day-to-day operations. Again, it's that higher level sort of thinking of yourself in a hot air balloon, if you will, looking down on the district and saying, gosh, is this system running effectively and really supplying our students with everything they need to be successful, and doing that through the superintendent?
I think it's also important for board members to realize you're not governing as really individuals. You're governing as an entity. So individual board members really don't have any legal authority to act or make decisions on behalf of the school district. You're making those decisions and you're governing as, 7 members if you're a local board, or 5 members if you're an ISD board. And your authority as an individual board member is combined with the authority of the 6 other members serving on that board, and you execute that authority through board policy. And a lot of times that policy gives direction to your administration on making decisions on behalf of the board as an entity, not on behalf of an individual.
I really like that distinction, Debbie, of not being managers, but there being something different when it comes to actual governance, because I do think that those are 2 terms that folks can pretty often conflate, right, with and confuse with one another. So that's really helpful. Anything else to add on this particular question before we move ahead, folks? All right, so as to give you your time and space, Brad, we thought it might be just easiest, because we know you get a lot of different legal questions from a lot of spaces, but you also hear similar ones time and again. So why don't you talk to us a little about what is the most common question that you're getting in terms of legal advice and guidance right now, and how are you responding?
I think probably the most common question I've been receiving is how to fill a school board vacancy. Now, if you were just elected to the school board, you maybe haven't encountered this yet, but you likely will be within some point of your term. It's funny. I've been with MASB, 26 years, and when I first started, hardly ever received a question about filling a vacancy and how to process that. Maybe 3-4 times a year. But within the last couple of years, I would say it comes up multiple times a week. And I guess it's just a reflection of kind of the way boards are set up now, and how folks are kind of transient, a little more transient in their lives than they used to be. And I'm not sure if moving to 6-year terms has any impact on the number of resignations we have, but that could have something to do with it as well. But if you do have a resignation on your board, the first thing that you should know is that it's really not controlled by law. There isn't a process set out in the law on how you go about filling that vacancy. That's going to be addressed in your board bylaws. The only really legal requirements that you need to follow in filling that vacancy, that one, it must be filled within 30 days. And if it's not filled within 30 days, then your ISD board will fill the vacancy. And then 2, you're required to follow all of the Open Meetings Act requirements in filling that vacancy. So are interviews required when you have candidates applying to fill that vacancy? Under law, they are not. So you go to your board policy. Some policies say the board will interview all applicants. So if you get 15 applicants, your policy pretty much binds the board to interview all 15 of those applicants. Your policy may give you a little bit more flexibility, indicating the board may interview all applicants, and that way you can narrow the pool down to a manageable number and maybe conduct 5 interviews. But if you are conducting interviews, those interviews must be done in an open meeting. The Open Meetings Act is clear on that. All appointments to a public office by a public body must be done in a public meeting. So when you're going through the process of narrowing the pool of applicants or making the final decision on filling that vacancy, all votes must be open and transparent. You can't have any secret ballots. That doesn't tell your community how you're voting on a particular matter. So if you're doing a ranking process and you're given the ability to rank all the candidates from 1 to 5, those rankings must be publicly disclosed. And must be recorded in your minutes as well. So someone attending the meeting can see how each board member is ranking the candidates, and also someone reading the minutes can determine how the members were ranked as well, or the candidates were ranked as well. Ultimately, the final vacancy appointment must be by a majority vote. This is an issue I just covered in the most recent issue of Leaderboard magazine, where if you have one vacancy and you have an individual absent at that meeting, so you have 5 people present at that meeting, a 3-2 vote wouldn't be sufficient for filling that vacancy. It would have to be a 4-1 vote under those circumstances. So once you get that majority vote, your new board member takes the oath of office, accepts that office, and then will serve until the next election. If there are years remaining on that vacated term after that next election, then you would have an abbreviated term on that ballot. So a lot of information on filling a vacancy. MASB does have a publication on this that we're currently updating, and I usually will write an article for Leaderboard when we get close to election on how your election ballot may be impacted by a resignation between the past 2 elections. So MASB does make an effort to ensure that everyone has proper guidance on filling a vacancy on their local or ISD board.
Brad, that's a great explanation. One of the things we've taught, you mentioned the 6-year term. It does seem like when they changed to November elections and created that 6-year term option, that we started seeing, that increase of people. That's a long time for somebody to serve, particularly if they've served 6 and now they're in their second 6-year term. Like you're like, oh, this is 12 years. So it does cause, individuals to think that way. 12-year commitment is a long time. And I think one of the other things, and we don't necessarily as MASB say, oh, you should do this or shouldn't do this, but definitely we've seen boards of education. MASB pushes our Get on Board campaign every election cycle to make sure that boards are recruiting candidates and really trying to get people to run. And I do think since we've started doing that and made boards and superintendents more proactive in thinking about who their next board members are, we've also seen instances where 4 years into a 6-year term, the person knows they're going to be stepping down at the end of the year, or I shouldn't say, maybe 5.5 years into a term. They make a choice to step down to give the board that opportunity to appoint, so that then that person is on the ballot as a person, or maybe gets their feet wet, because sometimes convincing people to run for the Board of Education is difficult. Convincing them to apply to be appointed isn't quite as difficult. And once appointed, they often, of course, will run, and as Brad mentioned. So I think there's a couple of things that have caused a change there where we see this appointment process changing. It's, I think, boards being more proactive as they think about where's our board going to be next term and years after that. And that 6-year term, it becomes a long time for some to serve on a board. Of course, we have members that have served on boards for 50 years, and clearly a 6-year term wouldn't bother them. But I think for some, that's a long commitment.
Well, and it may be that our next question ties in a little bit to where some of those vacancies arise as well, which is how do boards, Brad, thinking again about the power of governance being held within that body, how does that body work effectively if within itself it's divided, or there are divisions that are holding it back from doing the work?
Oh, I know you referenced Brad.
Give the solutions to that.
I know you referenced Brad, but maybe I could take a stab at it first.
I would like you to take a stab at it. Yes.
That's probably the most, the question that I get the most is how do we become more effective? If we're already good, how do we get better? But if we're having challenges at a board table with our governance team, and that includes the superintendent, how do we get better? What are some steps we can take, processes we can put in place? And, those are all conversations that I have when a board member calls and talks to me about that. Does the district have norms in place? Have they agreed to how they're going to treat each other while they do the work? Do they have board operating procedures in place? Brad mentioned policy, but another level of some structures that can help boards really cement some things about how they're going to go about the work are called board operating procedures. And those really help guide a board because they have good conversation around the development of those things, and they work out their differences there so that when a topic is brought up, they have a way to handle it, even in their disagreement. They know what the expectations are. They know how they're going to treat each other, and they know that it's okay to have differences of opinion, but they also understand that it's important how they deal with the differences. And so those two things, having those in place, and I encourage new board members to go back and look, just as we would their policies. Ask your district, do we have norms in place? Do we have board operating procedures? And the final one is, do we have a strategic plan in place that helps us guide our work as well? So that when those differences of opinion come up at the table, we're all focused on the same end result, the vision we've put in place, the mission that we've agreed to. And it really is those structures that help them work through those differences. I don't know if the gentleman would have anything to add to that.
I guess I can't emphasize, importance of policy enough. Many of the questions I get from board members, I will direct them back to their policy. Now, in some cases, it will be addressed by a statute or a case, but a board operates through its bylaws and its policies, and if there is a disagreement amongst board members of what happened at a meeting or how a decision was made, more times than not, your bylaws or your policies are going to provide the solution to that problem.
And I would add too, I think you do have those very, I will say more black and white issues that Brad are talking about, where a policy really addresses things. But we are seeing more and more kind of places within a board, and frankly within our families and society and other places, where it is personality conflict, it is political difference, it is just talking about an issue that is difficult to kind of move people on. And Debbie talked about the work that we do and how we can help try to facilitate conversations to help local boards. And sometimes I think it is just building relationships, right? It is always, and I've spent a career, I did most of my career in lobbying for MASB and worked with Republicans and Democrats, over the years, often ones that MASB didn't agree with on a number of things. And I really focused on trying to build the relationship. It was always easier for them and I to be able to have a discussion and maybe disagree on a topic, but find common ground where we could. And so when I think about a divided board, whether it's divided between the individual board members, or sometimes we'll see a divide in part of the board with the superintendent, one of the, I think, most tried and true methods is really building a relationship individually, not when you're discussing that item that has divided you, but getting to know each other. Often we are in smaller communities in Michigan. Not all of our communities, school districts are super large. We know each other, and it's figuring out what commonalities do we have and how do we come together on that, because I think that becomes a way to start bridging gaps. And that's becoming more and more important as we see this kind of division that's still not in the majority of our districts by any stretch, but definitely we're seeing it crop up more often.
And one thing to add to that is that, if a board is experiencing those challenges, they don't have to deal with it themselves. Oftentimes it's hard for someone internally to facilitate the conversation because they're actually part of the concern. And so having someone from the outside, whether it's MASB or someone else that they trust, to come in and guide the conversation can really help them see avenues they might not see when they're in the midst of it, right? And so that learning together, that setting time aside away from the business, right? The business is obviously important, but sometimes setting up those times when they can work together, learn how to be a team, will really facilitate that, being more successful at the table, doing the business. The research shows learning together makes, boards more effective. I mean, it's out there. So, but it's finding time to do that, right? It's another commitment that they're going to have to make to be proactive, potentially in their approach, or be reactive if they have already started experiencing some challenges.
And I think that's something that I hear a lot in terms of guidance being given is if you have the opportunity to ensure that those structures are in place and that learning can happen before you experience challenge, before you experience friction, do that and ensure that there are those guidelines that everyone is bought into and that everyone understands as you do your work going forward. Oftentimes it's at the moment when friction arises, right? That it comes to the head, and that is a more challenging time for sure to address those concerns.
Yeah, one of the things when we're in workshop settings or even in other trainings that MASB hosts, and we'll talk about the norms and those structures I mentioned earlier, they'll say, oh gosh, everything's going well. We don't really need those in place. And my response is always, when things are going that well, identify the things that are helping it to be that way. Get them in writing now, because it's so much easier to agree on those things when things are going well. Then you have them to rely on when things become challenging.
Okay. Thank you, Larissa, who is keeping me honest about questions coming in. We have a couple questions that we've gotten, and it might be a good time as we think about order and we think about decision making to go ahead and ask a question that's coming about Robert's rules. So Brad, I'm going to assume that this is something you'll take on. Do most boards follow Robert's Rule of Order? If it's in your bylaws, there are certain issues that parliamentary procedure supersedes Roberts. I have felt Roberts is a guideline. Am I correct or not, is the question.
So yeah, I would say most of our members do adopt Robert's Rules of Order as their parliamentary procedure. And that's kind of how it's been trending in the past. There was always the argument that school boards should not adopt Roberts. It's too complicated. It's impossible to fully comply with Robert's Rules of Order because of all the rules. So why even adopt it? I think most boards have abandoned that thought and have adopted it because you need some guidance beyond what is provided in the law and what is provided in your bylaws, and Robert's Rules of Order fills in those gaps in terms of holding a meeting in the public. Now, yes, Roberts is a guide. It does not supersede your bylaws, and it does not supersede Michigan law. So a couple examples. One is what constitutes a vote of the board. Under section 1201 of the school code indicates it's a majority vote of the members currently serving on the school board. When you compare that standard to Roberts, which indicates it's a majority of the members present, you have a conflict. Going back to that example I provided earlier in filling the vacancy, under Robert's Rules of Order, a 3-2 vote would be a valid vote. And that would, be a vote to fill your vacancy. Under the school code, that's not a valid vote. You need 4 votes in that situation. So that's a case where the school code supersedes Roberts. Another example is the role of the board president in the meeting. Now, certainly your board president is chairing the meeting, overseeing it, but the board president can be an active participant in voting and making motions. And that's a little bit different than what Roberts indicates. Roberts says that if the board president is going to kind of insert themselves into the meetings, they have to step away from from chairing the meeting and being the president. That's not the case with the local school board. Your board president was elected or appointed just like the 6 other members. Just because they've been given that title of board president doesn't mean they lose their ability to make motions or vote on motions. So even though it's a bit contrary to Roberts, your board president, may make motions and may participate in the deliberations, and obviously may vote on motions as well. But I do think it's a good idea for our boards to adopt Robert's Rules of Order. Yeah, I think there should be some type of parliamentary guidance, beyond what you find in the law and what's in your bylaws.
Brad, I want to take that one a step farther, and we dealt with this at MASB early on in our careers here with our delegate assembly, and we changed our language to actually say that, Robert's rules will be, I think we say, used as a guide. I think the previous language was like, it will be followed or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've sat on a board of education, and I found in our case, I'm sure we had Robert's rules in our bylaws, but we were in a small rural county, and we tended to, be somewhat casual in our meetings. And so we likely didn't, if we were to look at Robert's rules, follow it exactly. And sometimes, you even see in meetings where people are using Robert's rules to, in essence, cause problems within the meeting because somebody didn't make quite the right motion and that sort of things. Like, what's your guidance there where it's like Robert's rules is being used as a hammer to say you have to follow it exactly, as opposed to just, hey, it is the template that we're going to use to move through this, to have the process like you say that they need, but maybe be somewhere where it's not being overly formal and causing problems, unless the board agrees that's what they want to do.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the latter. It shouldn't be used as a weapon. It really is a tool, more so for your board president, and ensuring that you have order in your meeting. You're properly following procedure in terms of making motions, amending those motions, voting on those motions. And if you miss a step or you do something that's not fully in compliance with Roberts, it shouldn't have any impact on the ultimate decision that a majority of the board, voted to go this way. That it really shouldn't impact that. Now, certainly you could get some pushback from your community if you continue to, not follow Roberts when it is indicated in your bylaws that you're using it for a guide. So, yeah, I would suggest that your board president at least have some familiarity with Robert's Rules of Order to ensure that you're making your best effort to comply with those rules.
And in addition to that, in our Certified Board Member Award Program, or CBAs, as we call them, we have a great parliamentary procedure course. And what I would suggest is that if a board really wants to sort of delve in and become more aware of that they take that class together, and we can do that within their district. Someone will come out and work with the board. They don't have to come to one of our classes. And then that way everybody's aware of it. And so you lose that situation then where one person is sort of the only keeper of the knowledge, right? And so that when things do get sort of sideways, everybody knows what might be the next steps. I would certainly say at least a couple people. If you don't want to take that route, the board president and maybe someone else to sort of have someone as a backup. But we offer some great training in that. And so if that's something that's of interest, I would encourage them to look in that direction.
All right, we have another question that's come in that actually I'm not going to read, because I'm going to read the one we planned to ask, and then I'm going to follow up with specifically some of the things that came in through the chat because they're very closely related. Any suggestions about how board members can better convey to their communities the role the nonpartisan role of the board and the role of governance. Because sometimes their communities may not understand or may not believe that that's actually their responsibility and their job.
Well, and I think Jesse, sometimes even the individual board members don't understand fully the role, and everybody that's a board member started off as a community member. And, we've all heard many times from board members in their first 6 months or first year, wow, I didn't realize that this is what my job was going to be as a school board member. I thought it was going to be X, Y, or Z. We've really tried as an association to get in front of this, because it's a relatively new question that's starting to crop up more often about that role and what is it, and how do I communicate that with my community or with the attendees at our board meetings. And so we have started doing town hall meetings in election years that anybody is welcome to attend, not just those running for office, but if a district shared, it could be anybody in your community. And we talk about what the role of that board member is going to be. If you're interested in running, Debbie facilitates a lot of those. Brad participates in some of them from a legal perspective. But I think it's a kind of an iterative process, in the sense that first, I think the board has to come to conclusion on what your role is. And yes, we have lots of information. We do roles and responsibility training, like we do that, but there are also places where you're talking about, Debbie mentioned earlier about board operating procedures. Some of that might get into, that does get into like that role and explaining it, what the superintendent's going to do versus what the board is going to do, who's going to communicate to the media or to the public. And so all of that kind of can get handled. So I think you have to think about, what are we as a leadership team going to agree on? How are we then going to communicate that with our general public? And I don't think boards have ever really taken that conversation on. And I think it's difficult because even though I think it might be a good idea to start doing it, when you send a newsletter home and it covers the Board of Education and their role, who's going to read it? Like, how many people are going to take the time to read it because they're like, oh, I'm not worried about the board, but 6 months later they're in front of the board because something has come up that's made them want to address the Board of Education. So I think you do as much as you can on the front end. Somebody posted in the chat, we have what is called a social contract, a little bit different than what we're talking about here, but it might be a place where, attached to your agenda, like you might actually put on the back of an agenda, like, here's what our beliefs are. You might put, here's the role of the board, so that they know as they're coming to address the board, this is what you address the board to the board versus what you address to the superintendent. We're hearing much more in the last few years about the public comment period. And I know Brad gives guidance on length of time of public comment as far as individual speakers. But some guidance that you could give as part of that agenda or reiterated would be great. Another place that that conversation can happen so that the board understands, MASB now, about maybe 6 years ago, Debbie, adopted governance standards. And I'm going to actually, if I hit return, I'll put a link to those in the chat. And our goal when we first put those out there was really for boards to have a conversation about, how do you act as a board or conduct yourself as a board, and what do you do as an individual board member. And our hope was that our guide really is a bunch of questions to create the conversation. And then our hope was you would reach consensus as a board that here's how we're going to do things, and that boards would actually put, like, up on the wall of their boardroom, like, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to be as a board. And that means your audience could read it, and any public that would be coming in and out of that room for other reasons would be able to know that. You could share it on your district website if you wanted to. I don't think a lot of boards did the work and the questions. They didn't take the step of actually putting it out there so that our communities could be reminded all the time about that. And I think that is a place where it would be helpful when you think about your community to be just transparent about, here's what we believe the role of the board is. Here's how we're going to communicate that during the course of a meeting and maybe during the course of a year. I did see, Nathan, you just posted that the link is not public. My apologies for that. Larissa is the one that you posted going to be public then? All right. And so anyways, I think that it's kind of a multi-step process, like figure it out first from a board perspective. What do you see as using your operating procedures, maybe having governance standards, or, a social contract, as was mentioned earlier, and then move that out to your community and during a board meeting so that those that are in attendance know at every meeting how this is going to work, so that you're just well covered. And I think you're going to have to do it over time, because we have reached a place where our meetings have become more difficult, with community members really coming in with very distinct views. And often, as one of the questions that came up earlier was, their distinct views, in many cases now they have become tied into partisan views. And not only do we see that at the community, we see it at the board level itself. And I think that the board member that posed the question about nonpartisan positions, that is, I would argue to anybody that wants to argue with me, and that includes the two political parties in the state, both MASB and boards of education, that there's no place for partisan politics. Decisions are being made in the best interest of children, and that's of all the children within a school district. We have to at MASB, because we're a 501c3, the law says that we can't go down the road of endorsing candidates or anything like that. And yes, we can take positions on policy issues at the legislature. But as boards of education, I think you need to also think about how you're going to address that. I think relationship building has a big impact. Debbie has served on boards. I have served on an ISD board, and Debbie and I may have both our own personal political beliefs, and they may be partisan in nature. But over the years, when we were board members, everybody on a board might know that there's 7 individuals and they have their own views. It was extremely rare that a conversation came up that got tied to one political party or the other. And now we're in a place where, again, the majority of issues that board members are going to face are not partisan in nature. And you're not going to have that partisan DR kind of mindset, but we have some hot button issues that seem to keep becoming before boards, sometimes appropriately, sometimes maybe not, that is causing a divide. And I think what we're going to have to learn to do is learn how to have civil conversations, allow people that have their own political views as board members to express them, and then try as individuals to keep in mind the decisions are being made not on a partisan basis, but on a student basis. And I know that's easier said than done, but the more that we can divest our politics from the decisions that we're making as individuals at a board table, that is the right direction. As Brad said, boards are a governance body, and they are not individuals at that point. They are making a decision as a group, not as 7 individuals. That's not how, we're not the legislature where you're elected as a representative to the legislature. That is not how boards work, even though I think our citizens think, well, you're here to represent my neighborhood, or you're here to represent my view. That is not the case in school boards.
Jesse, before you go on to the next question, I just want to go back to something Don talked about a little bit earlier, as far as that, understanding what your role is. And I, shortly after the election, I talked to a lot of new board members in various settings, and I encourage them to really think about, once you really understand what your role is, and this may sound a bit trite, and I don't mean it to be, but they need to figure out their elevator speech, so that when they're approached away from the board table, because mostly what Don talked about was in a board meeting setting, but they're going to be approached away from the board table, whether it's at a football game or the grocery store or any number of, situations. And they need to have given it some thought about how they're going to explain to the community member what their role is and is not. And the next step being, how to best handle their concern. Because that's where they're really going to give value back to that community member, is in sharing what their next step should be, not necessarily approaching the board to expect a solution. And so it's that part of educating them that is part of that responsibility as well. It's not enough to know what your role is. You also have to be able to convey it. And most often it's going to be on a one-on-one situation that they're going to trip up. And attached to that is they have to be consistent, right? It doesn't matter whether it's a stranger or their neighbor or best friend. They have to be consistent with their response and giving them the help they need. And that's usually at a much lower level where the issues can be addressed.
I love that. And I love the idea that boards, one of the things I talk about with boards sometimes from a communication standpoint is that elevator pitch, it would be great if you could collect around it. You know, because whether you're a new board member or you're seasoned, we are shifting into spaces where there may be some misconceptions about what you should and shouldn't be doing on that board. And so having all of the board members really collect around that elevator pitch so that it is also coming consistently from the members of the board out to community members, I think is really powerful. Another thing that I just as we think about getting word out or building understanding for community members about the real role of a board, I really strongly recommend having boards build advocacy groups of local influencers. Like, find your folks who are willing to take the time and learn about what your role is, what you do, and how that decision-making process actually happens, so that there are some other sort of pillars of the community who have influence and who people speak with that will be informed enough to also provide accurate information as to what your role really is, and how you go about making decisions as board members. So that's another thing I think is pretty effective, especially in smaller communities. That
Jesse,
is,
I was
yeah.
on something that this kind of conversation piqued something. I was at a county association meeting a couple of weeks ago, and a board member, at this time I wasn't presenting. They had somebody else speaking about civility at their meeting, and a board member stood up and asked the question of the presenters. She is recently elected to a board last November, so been on the board for 6 months. Did run kind of with concerns about the direction of the district, and had a group of supporters behind her getting her into office. And her question was, I've been on the board for 6 months now. Some of the things that I believed that were true about transparency were not true. And she now has greater understanding of her role as a board member, how the district makes decisions. And the question was, how does she go back to those that supported her and help explain to them that, hey, maybe maybe some of our views are still true and we're working on those things. Maybe other things weren't. And how do I communicate that, hey, I understand now I'm a government's team member. I'm not one of 7 that's advocating that sort of thing. And it's the first time in my career anyways, probably, that I've heard somebody really pose that publicly, to think like, how do I go back and have that conversation? And Debbie and I actually were talking about this after that. And that's not an easy thing, but it is what I think we see for a lot of people. Hopefully they get into the role and understand, oh, this is a little different than I thought, or it was a more complex process than what we saw at the board meeting to get to the decision that the district made. And it's not easy to go back. And in this case, the presenter said, you just have to have the conversation. And as Debbie said, it's likely going to be a lot of one-on-one conversations with those individuals that supported you. And in the end, the presenter said, you may decide that it's okay to be unelected if you now have changed your direction as an individual, and you are, a part of this board culture, and you now agree that this is where we're going to go. And if your supporters 6 years from now, 4 years from now say, we don't like what you're doing, and you've decided, well, I'm doing the best that I can, that maybe that becomes the outcome, or maybe the voters decide to keep you and your supporters aren't able to unseat you, but hopefully nobody gets to that place. But there is that when you get elected by a supportive group, depending on what that was and what you were going, could be a closing of a building or any number of things. Like having that tough conversation on that one-on-one basis, like Debbie was talking about, to say, well, here's what I've learned. Here's why we do things this way. And after I've now talked with my 6 other board members, I'm comfortable with this. I'm not comfortable with this other decision that we talked about before, and I'm still working on that with my board within the parameters of our Board of Education. But the conversation prompted me to remember that, that question that was posed a couple weeks ago, and I thought it was relevant.
What I really like about that is that it shows that growth mindset that board member came to the position with, right? I mean, that board member entered that role with a willingness to learn differently and ask questions that even pushed their own ideas that they might have come in with. And as folks do develop that sense of what this position might really mean, that's different from what I might have thought when I got elected, I would say that you are in a particularly excellent space to relate to folks who may have had different expectations of you. And that, as a communicator, that is a great place to meet someone, to say like, hey, I really had thought like you think XYZ was happening, or XYZ was part of a board member's service, but I've been surprised to see these other things. So I think finding that common relationship early on, when you also are surprised by things you're learning, is a good access point to helping people better understand that change that they may also benefit from seeing.
It's probably one of the best things you can bring to the board table, an open mind.
That is, I think, a pretty fantastic place to close. We are closing in on our time here, and I think that it's a decent space to wrap up, and maybe we do leave out those parts of quick suggestions. 6 months into service, school year wrapping up. Any final words of wisdom from the 3 of you as these courageous folks continue the good work of board service?
I guess my final thought would be, and kind of ties to what Don and Debbie were saying on the role of the board member. I try to simplify it into kind of putting it into big buckets. So the first bucket is board policy. That's how you operate under the board. That's your primary responsibility. Second bucket, hiring, overseeing, evaluating the superintendent. Okay. Third, adopting your budget as a board, which traditionally comes recommended by your administration. And then fourth, adopting your strategic plan as a board. And you're the board member individually and collectively, that's what you're operating under, and you're responsible for. My opinion are those 4 big buckets. There may be, obviously there's little things that go beyond those, but that's when I'm teaching my policy class, those are the buckets I focus on.
Yeah, I think, I'm going to echo what Brad said, and just a couple of other things. Encourage your board to be proactive in their approach, right? Don't wait for problems to rear up and become even bigger problems. And if they do experience challenges, don't wait. Reach out to someone if that looks like that might be the best solution for assistance. Because it really does boil back down to what Don said. This is about what's best for all the students in the district. And so in order for that to happen, board members have to be the best they can be at their work. And that sometimes means learning individually to give them some, strength in some areas they may not be very strong in yet. And it also means learning together to build that trust and work on those relationships.
But I will close just by saying thank you again for everybody in attendance. But to look at the same and reiterate what is said earlier, I think if your board is right now in a good place and you have good relationships, I saw a lot of conversation about a social contract and governance standards and how does that work and what do you do? If everything's going well right now, it is the perfect time to engage in that conversation and adopt them if you don't have them, because that sets you up for the next election where maybe there's turnover and you've created a board culture that can exist going forward that represents your community. So I think that is very important. Much more difficult to do when you're in a divided board situation, and maybe not even something that we would say that you need to dive into, because then you might have to do it piece by piece, not all at once. So make sure that you're thinking of things that way. And I think importantly, be good examples to your communities. You model behavior to the students in your schools and to the citizens of your community. If you are fighting, they are going to think it's okay for them to be in that same place. So, do your best to conduct yourselves in a manner that's much better than we see in Lansing or in Washington, D.C. I hold board members to a higher standard than I do our elected representatives in either of those two cities. So thank you for all that you do for the students in Michigan. I know the job is not easy, and we do appreciate the work that you're doing in your communities.
Absolutely. Thank you all. And I think with that, we're going to sign off and let you back to your days. Have an excellent rest of your afternoon.